Alors, comme j'ai dit, il me fait un énorme plaisir d'être ici parmi vous aujourd'hui. Vous m'avez fourni un accueil des plus chaleureuses et je suis très reconnaissante. Yes, I am here all the way from Ottawa, and it's a lovely, lovely opportunity. It's been some time since I've been in Fredericton, and I've never been in ce centre before. It's a beautiful, beautiful institution. So as was mentioned, Arts NB commissioned me in the fall of last year to prepare a report looking at arts funding in the province, and to do so in a domestic sense, so the arts funding model here in New Brunswick, but also in a comparative sense, so to look at funding vis-a-vis other jurisdictions. And as we know, there have been some announcements that the provincial government has made since that time. So I'm hopeful that this report, which wasn't prepared with a view to those announcements, but was prepared independently from them, I'm hoping that this report will be helpful in some sense as the province is working through future directions for arts funding in the province. Alors, comme a été mentionné, je suis professeure à l'Université d'Ottawa. Ma formation est en administration publique et politique publique. Alors, j'amène une perspective de gouvernance à mes recherches et j'espère que cela va vous être utile dans le cadre de vos délibérations dans les prochains jours et les prochaines semaines. Next slide. Alors, pour ce qui est de la présentation, je ne vais pas présenter trop longtemps. Vous avez une copie du rapport et certains d'entre vous peut-être ont déjà eu l'occasion de le lire. Mais j'aimerais évidemment vous fournir les grandes lignes du rapport. Alors, je vais commencer juste pour assurer que tout le monde est sur la même longueur d'onde par rapport aux objectifs et le cadre de la recherche. Je vais ensuite parler du contexte du financement des arts au Canada, ainsi que le financement des arts ici dans la province du Nouveau-Brunswick, et le financement des arts dans les juridictions comparatrices. Alors, l'étude est une étude comparative également. Et je vais terminer, une partie de mon mandat a été justement d'identifier des opportunités, des occasions de renforcement du financement public des arts au Nouveau-Brunswick. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned, Arts NB commissioned me in the fall of last year to undertake this research study. And the desire was to have an independent external assessment of the arts funding model in the province in the context of the program review that the government has been undertaking around expenditures across a variety of sectors, including the arts and culture as well. The research objectives were twofold. First, to identify, in essence, what is the model of arts funding in the province of New Brunswick in terms of what is funded, who is funded, what are the eligibility criteria, how is funding reported on, etc., and as well, how are funding decisions made. So when it comes to individual programs, how are applications judged and how are decisions made based on applications. And then following that, to begin to identify areas of strength and weakness in that funding model, in the public funding model, as well as opportunities for improvement and potentially greater collaboration between the Arts Council and the Department of Tourism, Heritage and Culture. The methodology that was utilized is a qualitative analysis of relevant documentation. So that documentation, just so people are aware, involved primary documents from Arts NB, as well as from the Department of Tourism, Heritage and Culture, so program guidelines, information available on each organization's website, annual reports, and the like, as well as scholarly literature. There's relatively little research that's been conducted on provincial arts and cultural policy, but there has been some that's been undertaken, some of it, as was mentioned, in collaboration between myself and Diane Saint-Pierre, who some of you might know out of l'Université du Québec, l'INRS, that looks specifically at the origin and evolution of provincial and territorial cultural policy in the country. But there's relatively little literature, but there certainly was some that was relevant for purposes of this study. And then, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, a look at where the New-Brunswick Arts Funding model sits in comparison to comparator jurisdictions in the country. And the idea there, of course, is not to suggest that all jurisdictions should be undertaking arts funding in the same fashion, but really to get a sense of, well, where does New Brunswick's arts funding model sit vis-a-vis comparator provinces and the federal government. Next slide. Alors, pour ce qui est du le contexte du financement des arts au Canada, le rapport a commencé avec une évaluation, une analyse du contexte historique pour ce qui est du financement des arts. Et au Canada, la commission Massey-Lévesque, qui a été établie en 1949 par le gouvernement Louis Saint-Laurent, a été vraiment un moment charnière pour ce qui est du développement des politiques et du financement des arts publics au Canada. So it's not as if jurisdictions, whether at the provincial or the federal level, weren't being active in the arts and cultural sector prior to the Massey-Lévesque Commission. There was certainly support that was being allocated to the arts sector, in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, but it really wasn't until the Massey-Lévesque Commission of 1949, this early post-war period, where you saw a much more focused approach and conceptualization of what government's role is in the arts sector. So in the Canadian context at the federal level, this early post-war period was really crucial. So you have to, if you sort of thinking back to early post-war, Canada emerged from the war as a strong country. Europe was in tatters, as people will recall, and there was some tremendous concern in the country about how, to what extent domestically the Canadian state and the country itself had appropriate artistic, cultural, and post-secondary infrastructure befitting of the nation as it emerged from the war. There was also some concern, a tremendous concern, again, given the horrors of Nazi Germany, for democracy, and how does one ensure that freedom of expression is retained in that context. So the Massey-Lévesque Commission, and the formal title of the commission is the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters, and Sciences, was really the government's response to trying to identify what do we need to do as a federal government, that was the focus clearly as a federal commission, but what do we need to do as a federal government in these areas? Because there was tremendous concern about the extent to which Canada didn't have its own indigenous, as it were, sort of domestic, strong set of artistic and post-secondary infrastructure. And in fact, much of the funding that was coming into Canada at that time for those activities was coming from the United States. So it was coming from foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, that were doing a lot of work to actually support the early artistic and university infrastructure in this country. So there was concern about that. What about the development of Canada from the perspective of the country itself? So when the commission, and this, again, not to spend too much time on the history here, but it is quite important. When the commission undertook to deliver on its mandate, it commissioned a large number of research studies, and those research studies really underscored that there was relatively little artistic activity. There certainly wasn't much in the way of government support for creative expression in the country, and what support did exist was largely coming in from outside of the country. So that was of tremendous concern to the commissioners. One of the key recommendations that came out of the Massey-Lévesque Commission was the recommendation to create a federal arts council, what we now know as the Canada Council for the Arts. And this is something that the artistic community had been calling for years, I mean, going back even to the early 1940s, that the country needed support from government for the arts, but that support should be delivered using what we now refer to as the arm's length principle. So that government support for the arts, but not controlling the artistic expression. So the Commission, when it was exploring this area and trying to develop its recommendations around what should be done in the country, spent a good deal of time looking at alternative governance arrangements. So if government's going to support the arts, how should it do so? What should be the governance arrangements underpinning that? And this is very much where that arm's length principle came from. So that the commissioners looked very closely to what was taking place in other jurisdictions, notably what was taking place in Britain, now obviously the United Kingdom. And at that time, the UK, or Great Britain, had in place a Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, which later became the Arts Council of Great Britain, and now we know there are a variety of different arts councils in the United Kingdom. And the organizational arrangements underpinning the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts were very much built on this arm's length principle. Et je voudrais juste rapidement aller au prochain diapo et je vais revenir. Donc, est-ce qu'on peut aller au prochain diapo? So what the commissioners recommended was la création d'un conseil des arts et évidemment un financement aux artistes, à l'expression créative, mais d'une façon qui évite et qui garde cette activité-là, qui le garde à l'abri de l'ingérence politique. Alors, pour ce qui est d'un conseil des arts, si on regarde en bas ici, l'idée des décisions autonomes par rapport au financement des arts, avec une autorité qui est conférée par la législature. Alors, évidemment, c'est un acte de loi qui crée l'organisme, qui définit son mandat, la portée de ses activités, mais pour ce qui est des décisions en matière de financement des arts, que ces décisions-là soient autonomes. Alors que le Conseil des arts est un conseil d'administration, normalement nommé par le gouvernement, et imputable au gouvernement. Donc, on ne parle pas d'un organisme qui est complètement distancié, complètement déconnecté du gouvernement, mais là, pour ce qui est de l'autonomie de la prise de décision, que là, ce principe de arm's length s'apprime, et c'est vraiment au cœur du modèle du financement des arts dans un pays comme le Canada, où on a plusieurs conseils des arts, notamment au niveau fédéral, mais également au niveau provincial aussi. Alors, mais cela ne veut pas dire qu'un conseil des arts n'est pas imputable. Oui, le Conseil des arts est imputable à la législature, mais pour ce qui est de la prise des décisions, pour s'assurer que l'expression créative soit libre, que cette prise de décision-là, ces prises de décision-là soient de façon autonome. Et normalement, au fil des ans, avec l'évaluation par les pairs. Évidemment, on parle ici des pairs dans la communauté artistique. Des individus, des praticiens, etc., qui ont une expertise, qui sont à la fine pointe de leur discipline. Et au fil des ans, également, on a vu dans plusieurs juridictions le développement des ministères de la culture. Donc, ils sont nommés différemment à travers le pays. Mais là, la distinction pour ce qui est du ministère, un ministère est sous le contrôle du ministre. Donc, vraiment, est imputable directement au ministre. Et l'autorité avec laquelle les fonctionnaires travaillent dans un ministère, cette autorité est conférée et déléguée, c'est une autorité déléguée par le ministre. Et le ou la ministre, l'autorité qu'il ou elle détient, c'est une autorité qui est conférée par la législature. Alors là, c'est évidemment, à un moment donné, lorsque je parle de ce type d'information-là, I see everybody's eyes glaze over. I don't want to have a public administration session about, authority and responsibility and accountability, but it's very, very central to thinking about how arts funding in this country has developed and the way in which the vast majority of jurisdictions at the federal and provincial levels undertake to finance the arts. Alors, je vais revenir au dernier diapo, mais je vais revenir. Alors, tout ça pour dire que pour ce qui est des conseils des arts, et là, ça revient justement à Massey, la commission Massey-Lévesque, dans les années 50, le principe de l'autonomie de ces entités-là, l'évaluation par les pairs, et là, c'est un principe et un processus, une pratique qui a été développé au fil des ans. Et évidemment, l'idée là, c'est que les décisions qui soient prises par rapport aux subventions pour les artistes, c'est le mérite artistique qui prime et non pas la partisanerie ou des critères bureaucratiques. Alors, support from the state but not controlled by the state. Comme j'ai mentionné, à travers le Canada, au fil des ans, le développement de ce Conseil des arts-là, la création du Conseil des arts du Canada, là, ça a été fait en 1957. Dans les années qui ont suivi cette création-là, on a vu la création de plusieurs conseils des arts au niveau provincial à travers le Canada. Donc, ça a eu une espèce comme on dirait en anglais, demonstration effect. Alors, on a vu la province de l'Ontario, la province de l'Alberta, Terre-Neuve-et-Labrador, ici au Canada Atlantique, la création au fil des ans de conseils des arts au niveau provincial également, et avec ces mêmes principes-là, le principe d'autonomie. Et encore là, on ne parle pas d'un organisme qui est complètement déconnecté du gouvernement, mais vraiment pour la prise de décision pour des subventions, que l'organisme ait cette autonomie-là. Et aussi, au fil des ans, le développement de mécanismes de coordination entre les juridictions. Alors, comme on sait, au Canada, le secteur de la culture est un secteur partagé dans la Constitution canadienne. Donc, il y a des interventions au niveau fédéral ainsi qu'au niveau provincial. Et donc, au fil des ans, il y a eu des mécanismes de coordination qui ont été développés. Et au niveau fédéral, provincial, on a deux espèces de mécanismes de coordination. Le premier s'appelle le Canadian Public Arts Funders Network. And the Canadian Public Arts Funders Network brings together the chairs and executive directors of all of the arts councils at the federal and provincial level. And what's really important about the work of this network, and so those who are involved in the network are coming from Arts Councils, Arts NB, participates in these meetings, are very much about trying to coordinate activity across the country and also work together on shared interests. The artistic context is in constant change. There's been tremendous changes over the last number of years. So CPAF will work collectively on behalf of all of its members to try to identify areas where there's opportunity for collaboration. There are also what are referred to as tri-levels, and tri-levels bring together in each province or region all of the key public and in some instances private and foundation funders. So again, in the province of New-Brunswick, the key funders are brought together at the federal and provincial, municipal levels. Some foundation funders as well are brought together. And again, the idea here is to collaborate and to coordinate their respective efforts when it comes to funding the arts. A certain amount of overlap is fine, and we see that across the country. It's actually one of the strengths of our system. But where there can be opportunities for collaboration, these mechanisms enable that to go forward. Alors, pour revenir au prochain diapo, alors tout ça pour dire que lorsqu'on a des ministères versus des conseils et des arts, là on a deux entités, et à travers le Canada, ça, grosso modo, ça fonctionne comme ça, deux entités différentes qui appuient le secteur artistique avec un financement, mais avec des priorités normalement et des mandats différents, puis un focus différent les uns par rapport aux autres. Et je vais en parler davantage dans quelques minutes. Alors, prochain diapo. When it comes to arts funding in New-Brunswick, and here I should mention that I'm tremendously grateful to the authors of the chapter on New-Brunswick in the co-edited volume that I mentioned to you earlier, Danielle Bourgeois and Nicole Barriot. Some of you might be familiar with those names. They prepared for us a chapter that was just excellent on the province of New Brunswick, looking at, in essence, the history of arts funding in the province and how over the years, arts funding has evolved, and the governance arrangements for arts funding have evolved over time. So if you look at in historical terms, there was a development of a cultural affairs branch at the provincial level in 1968. The Arts Board legislation was passed in 1989. And both of these entities, notably the Cultural Affairs branch, if you're going back to 1968, we're talking about very small entities, right? So they grew over time. And one of the things that is fascinating about the history here in New Brunswick is that there have been these key moments, as it were, and this might be one of those moments, key moments where the artistic community has come together with the government, whether it's with the Arts Board, with the department, or collectively all parties coming together to look at how can we strengthen and improve arts funding in the province. And the artistic community, there are probably folks in this room who would be able to speak to this, and I'd be delighted to chat with you after the session today if you're available. There have been key moments where the artistic community has called for two things. The first of which being a dedicated department to culture, right? So a single government ministry that's dedicated to culture. That has not been something that the government has followed through on, as in most jurisdictions, provincial jurisdictions across the country, the Ministry of Culture, the department, deals with other areas beyond the arts and culture. So it could be housing, could be community affairs, a variety of different other areas. But the second thing that the artistic community in New Brunswick has called for, in the first instance, the creation of an arts council. And the creation of the Canada Council at the federal level created a real demonstration effect, as I mentioned earlier, and generated calls for the creation of provincial arts councils across the country. And here in New Brunswick, there was a really strong interest on the part of the artistic community for the creation of, again, this independent, autonomous organization to be able to distribute funding to the arts, but in a way that is free from political interference. Subsequent to the creation of the Arts Council, and when the Arts Council was first created, it had a relatively modest level of autonomy. So it was at some level housed in part within the then Department of Culture. I think it was Municipal Affairs. And the artistic community was dissatisfied with that state of affairs. Very much wanted for that Arts Council to have full autonomy along the lines of the slide that I just showed you, where you have an arts council with that level of independence when it comes to making grants. So that was something, again, in a previous moment, perhaps not dissimilar to this moment, where the artistic community came together and really called upon and pressed upon the government its desire for a greater level of autonomy for the Arts Board. A report was commissioned at that time by François Colbert, who some of you might know, who works out of HEC, has a research chair there, and the recommendations coming out of that report were really instrumental when it came to changing the Arts Board's legislation in 1999 to provide it with the level of autonomy that it currently has. So there has been greater autonomy for the Arts Board over time. En termes du programme du ministère du Tourisme, du Patrimoine et de la Culture et d'R&B, ici au Nouveau-Brunswick, il y a une panoplie de programmes pour les artistes et pour les organismes artistiques. Et des programmes qui appuient la création, la présentation, l'éducation par les arts, le développement de capacités au sein des organismes dans la province. Et en termes de la répartition de ces programmes-là entre R&B et le ministère, grosso modo, et là je parle vraiment grosso modo, R&B a une responsabilité pour la création, le développement en matière de carrière pour les artistes, et le ministère, de sa part, plutôt pour la présentation et la capacité pour les organismes. Mais là, c'est vraiment grosso modo. Je vais en parler un peu en plus de détails dans quelques minutes. Prochain diapo. Merci. Alors, en matière visuelle, if we think about the artistic process, we can think about the creation of artistic works, through to their presentation and through to access of the public. Now, everybody in this room would know far better than I that that is a high simplification of the way the artistic ecosystem actually works, and notably in the context of technological change and demographic change and development of new artistic practices and the like. But what I've done here is just to create something a little bit more easy to grapple with. Typically what one sees when it comes to arts councils and when it comes to culture departments is a division of labor between the two of them in terms of what they support, with arts councils tending more towards that side of creation, an artistic creation. Again, the idea being that when it comes to the government support of artistic creativity and the creation of artistic works, that there is an interest in having support from the government but not controlled by the government, right? To ensure that there's an autonomy when it comes to that decision making. Ici, au Nouveau-Brunswick, on voit, comme j'ai dit, grosso modo, c'est surtout R&B qui est à ce niveau d'activité-là, et le ministère qui est plutôt aux activités qui ont lieu après la création. Alors, la présentation, l'accès, les infrastructures culturelles, les événements au niveau local, les festivals, l'éducation par les arts, et ainsi de suite. Mais il y a, comme est identifié dans ce diagramme-ci, une espèce de chevauchement entre R&B et le ministère, parfois dans certaines parties de la création et de la présentation. Et là encore, je ne suis pas ici pour vous dire quoi faire. C'est vraiment pas mon rôle. C'est à vous autres de décider qu'est-ce qui est le mieux pour la province et pour son secteur culturel. Et un certain niveau de chevauchement n'est pas nécessairement mauvais en soi. Mais là, mon mandat a été vraiment d'identifier le modèle ici au Nouveau-Brunswick et comment ça fonctionne. Prochain diapo, s'il vous plaît. So a number of observations came through in the study. And so as I just mentioned, there is some level of program overlap and duplication between the department and Arts NB. And again, duplication, overlap is not necessarily a negative thing in and of itself, but from an external evaluator's perspective, sort of looking at the various programs, the logic of who does what and why was not entirely evident. Perhaps it is to folks in this room, but from an outside perspective, not always evident. In terms of the review of program guidelines and the way in which programs are administered, again, there could perhaps have been some greater clarity there. So the guidelines are not, program guidelines are not always clear when it comes to who is eligible for funding, what is eligible for funding, the way in which juries are utilized, for which programs are juries utilized, how are jury members selected, what precisely is their role when it comes to decision making with respect to individual grants, and the scoring as well. So the scoring of applications. What exactly are the criteria upon which juries or individual program officers are making decisions or recommendations around the allocation of funding. A number of programs at the department have flexible deadlines, which again may or may not, is not necessarily a negative in itself, but there's a question that can be raised there about flexible deadlines. If an organization says, we will begin receiving funding for program X at date Y, and we will distribute funding until there is no more funding, there's a question about whether that what is intended to be a flexible deadline in essence becomes a de facto deadline, because everybody wants to get that application in as soon as humanly possible before the funding runs out. So it's perhaps something to think about there. One of the things I was asked to look for is whether or not programs have off-ramps. Et ce que je veux dire par ça, c'est est-ce qu'il y a un moment où un organisme ou un individu devient plus éligible pour un programme. Donc une espèce de maturation ou diplomation, disons, d'un programme. Very few programs have off-ramps. So very few programs have a capacity or a set of guidelines that would reduce somebody's eligibility for that program over time. In terms of the art bank, moi j'ai été vraiment impressionnée par la banque d'œuvres d'art du Nouveau-Brunswick, mais l'une des choses que j'ai remarquées lors de l'évaluation, la législation qui a créé R&B stipule que ça va être R&B qui gère la banque d'œuvres d'art de la province. Pourtant, c'est plutôt le ministère qui gère les acquisitions et la banque d'œuvres d'art. Donc, il y a une espèce d'anomalie là. Et enfin, les renseignements sur les résultats des concours, donc qu'est-ce qui a été financé, combien de subventions ont été octroyées, quelle est la répartition de ces subventions par rapport aux disciplines, par rapport aux régions de la province, par rapport aux différentes communautés linguistiques, ethnoculturelles et ainsi de suite. Ces renseignements-là, pas toujours, ils pourraient être plus complets. Prochain diapo, s'il vous plaît. So the study, as I mentioned earlier, also looked at arts funding in comparative jurisdictions. Ils sont tous nommés là, le Manitoba, l'Ontario, le Québec, Terre-Neuve-et-Labrador, la Nouvelle-Écosse et le gouvernement fédéral. Et all of these jurisdictions have, again, as is the case here in New-Brunswick, an arts council as well as a Department of Culture, but the understandings of arts and culture differ across jurisdictions. And that was one of the things that when we undertook the research for the book that I mentioned to you earlier that looks at the origin and evolution of provincial and territorial cultural policy, we did not tell our authors, go and find out what jurisdiction X is doing when it comes to culture and here's how we're defining it. We left it to the authors to try in their research to understand how is culture and how are the arts conceived in that jurisdiction. And it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction what is and is not inside that basket of the arts and culture. And in the main, alors grosso modo, comme j'ai mentionné tantôt, les conseils des arts exécutent le financement pour la création, pour toutes les raisons qu'on a mentionnées tantôt. Et les ministères, c'est surtout un financement au secteur après la création. Alors, la présentation, l'accès, les infrastructures culturelles, et ainsi de suite. Cela étant dit, there's no one size fits all. Different jurisdictions do it differently. And there's, clearly, there are unique characteristics of each jurisdiction that have led them to develop the arrangements that they have developed. So those arrangements do differ across the country for some areas. Alors, l'éducation par les arts, là, ça diffère d'une juridiction à une autre. La formation professionnelle, est-ce que c'est le ministère, est-ce que c'est le conseil? Là, ça diffère également. Même chose pour ce qui est des acquisitions pour les banques d'œuvres d'art, là où on a des juridictions qui maintiennent une banque d'œuvres d'art. Prochain diapo. Alors, juste pour revenir, le présenter de façon visuelle, là, grosso modo, comme je viens de mentionner, c'est les conseils des arts qui ont la responsabilité pour le financement de la création et les ministres de la culture qui sont plutôt responsables, plutôt interviennent plutôt dans les domaines de présentation et accès. Prochain diapo. Alors, pour ce qui est du financement des arts au Nouveau-Brunswick, j'ai été mandatée d'identifier des occasions de renforcement, d'amélioration du système. Et pour revenir à la commission Massey et aux principes qui sont vraiment au cœur des modèles de financement des arts au Canada, il y a vraiment deux principes que j'encouragerais la province de tenir en compte lorsque il y a des changements qui sont potentiels. D'abord et avant tout, la confiance du public par rapport au système. Public confidence in the system. Right? That it is a system that is fair, that is unbiased, where freedom of creative expression, or creative expression is free to be undertaken. Alors, la liberté d'expression créative, l'impartialité, que le système soit juste. Alors, la légitimité du système, c'est vraiment important de garder cela en tête. Et deuxièmement, alors là, c'est plutôt c'est un principe informé par la démocratie. Puis deuxièmement, c'est un principe, oui, informé par la démocratie, mais plutôt par informé par des idées plus administratives. Alors, comment maximiser la création et l'accès aux arts et comment le faire d'une façon qui est efficace, qui est claire pour les gens, les individus et les organismes qui veulent mettre de l'avant des demandes de subventions. Et comment également tirer profit du point de vue du gouvernement de l'information que le gouvernement reçoit de tous les organismes et individus qui font demande à leur programme. So collectively, Arts NB and the Department of Tourism, Heritage and Culture has a tremendous amount of understanding of the artistic community. And that is in part as a result of the applications that come forward. There's lots of information that's provided in those applications. People in this room might sometimes think it's too much information that's asked for. It can be burdensome from that perspective. That said, that plus the jury systems where there are artists regularly involved in the funding decision-making process creates a level of expertise at both Arts NB, but also the Department of Tourism, Heritage and Culture, an understanding of the artistic community in New Brunswick that is really, really unparalleled. And so how can one put in place a set of governance arrangements between the Arts Board and the department, for example, that maximize government's understanding of that arts ecosystem, to have a really good understanding of what its needs are and what should be funded. Are there changes that should be made? Are there new programs that should be put into place? Are there different arrangements that should be contemplated to really maximize artistic creation as well as access to the arts for the benefit of all of the people of New Brunswick? Prochain diapo, puis là c'est le dernier diapo. So last slide. So the report identified 3 key areas where there are opportunities to strengthen arts funding in New Brunswick. And in a sense, they start from sort of the incremental to the more comprehensive. So starting with the more incremental, as I mentioned earlier, there's a real opportunity there to strengthen program guidelines and administration. So ensuring that there's clarity and transparency when it comes to who is eligible for funding, what precisely is being funded, and also clarity and transparency in assessment. And again, this really goes to the heart of what the legitimacy of the system and the integrity of the system, notably for the people who are here in this room. So how are these applications being assessed? And then very strong reporting on the results of competitions as well, so that there's clarity there and transparency there in what is being funded, how that funding, if one were to break it down, whether it's regionally, linguistically, by discipline, etc. So it's very clear where funding is being administered. At the end of the day, that's important for people in this room, but it's also important for the taxpayers of New Brunswick, for the citizens who ultimately are providing this funding. As I mentioned earlier, there's also this anomaly that came forward in the study around the New Brunswick Art Bank acquisitions, where there's a disconnect there between the legislation that created the Arts Board, the Arts Council, and the way that Arts Bank acquisitions are being undertaken in practice. Deuxièmement, il y a une opportunité pour augmenter la collaboration entre le ministère et Arts NB. Donc, comme je viens de mentionner, les 2 organismes ont des expertises et des expériences et des connaissances vraiment exceptionnelles par rapport à l'écosystème artistique dans la province. Donc, il y a des occasions de peut-être d'augmenter la fréquence d'échange d'informations sur les programmes, sur les priorités stratégiques. Donc, ça peut être une espèce de coordination entre les 2 organismes. Et il pourrait y avoir également une occasion d'augmenter la coordination entre les programmes qui sont offerts par les 2 entités. Et j'ai suggéré dans le rapport de commencer avec une cartographie, a mapping exercise, And I know that Arts NB has already done a little bit of this, putting in place sort of a diagram that looks at the different funding programs that are available, the deadlines for each of them. And this, again, could be something, that kind of a mapping exercise to see how does the whole stack up in terms of when deadlines fall, what is being funded, who is responsible for what, so that Arts NB and the department are at some level putting themselves in the shoes of applicants to try to clarify that system and potentially to coordinate some of the programs. There could be some coordination around when deadlines fall, potentially even coordination around what the application procedures look like, how those are administered. Et enfin, il y a également une opportunité, le rapport mentionne une opportunité pour consolider la gestion des programmes. Et donc, comme j'ai mentionné tantôt, il y a une espèce de chevauchement entre RNB et le ministère par rapport à certains programmes qui touchent notamment le financement pour les artistes en matière de création et en présentation. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a un potentiel de consolider certains de ces programmes-là et peut-être même la gestion de ces programmes-là? Et donc, comme je mentionne ici, comme je vais mentionner ici, désolé, que potentiellement, compte tenu du fait que le modèle de financement des arts au Canada, les conseils des arts ont surtout cette responsabilité pour la création et l'appui à la création, qu'il pourrait y avoir, parce qu'il y a une consolidation potentielle des programmes, que certains des programmes qui touchent la création, incluant potentiellement le financement aux organismes artistiques, ça pourrait être livré par RNB, l'entité qui appuie surtout la création. Mais évidemment, tout cela étant dit, il ne s'agit que d'un rapport. Donc, il y a beaucoup d'expérience dans cette pièce-ci. Je ne suis pas ici pour vous dire quoi faire, je n'ai pas cette autorité-là. L'expérience, l'expertise, la connaissance du milieu, c'est vous autres qui l'avez. That said, I'm hopeful that this report and this evaluation will be helpful at some level to the community as it's working through these issues. As I mentioned, and I believe it was mentioned at the outset, this report was commissioned well ahead of the announcement that the government made a few weeks ago. I wasn't aware that announcement was going to be made. As I understand it, most people weren't aware that announcement was going to be made. Now that it has been made, and there is the potential for fairly significant changes being undertaken here to the arts funding model in New-Brunswick, I'm hopeful that this report might help to stimulate some of those conversations and hopefully contribute in a positive way to them. So I will stop with that and happy to hear what you have to say.